Hello everyone, good morning. My name is Troy Dreyer. I'm an editor with Streaming Media Magazine, and welcome to the Discovery track for Streaming Media 2016. I should have asked, are we good for sound? Are you ready to record? Okay. In the future, I'll get the nod from you. So welcome to the Discovery track. We have a good time here. This is kind of a high energy track. This is the most fun track of all, the whole conference, I think, because this is the only one where we have short, punchy presentations, and they're giving you real useful advice that you can put to work as soon as you get back to the office. And you can ask them questions afterwards, and we have prizes. Starting up the day is Epiphan video. We've got David Kirk, Vice President of Marketing. He's going to be talking about 4K capture, and one of you will be going home with a 4K video capture card at the end of this. So David, take it away.
Okay, thanks a lot. So today I do want to talk about 4K live video streaming. So for those of you who aren't aware, I'm sure most of you are, 4K has a couple different resolutions, but the most popular one is 3840 by 2160. And it's exactly 4 times a 1080p stream and exactly 9 times a 720p stream. So it's a significant uplift in terms of resolution when we go from 720 or even 1080 up to 4K. Most of the time when people talk about 4K streaming today, just in the general lexicon, it's often with respect to over-the-top services. So things like Netflix or other streaming services where it's mainly a distribution problem. So the files are already up in the cloud, they're already encoded, and all you're doing is streaming those down to the user. And while that's not a trivial problem, live video streaming of an event is even more challenging than that, because you're not having that content already preloaded up in the CDN. You've got to get it there in real time. So it adds some additional challenges. So for today's talk, we're really talking about 4K live production. So when you're at an event and you're filming it live and it's happening in front of you, you're taking that experience and trying to bring it through a CDN to a large number of viewers. All of the encoding and switching, all of the production has to happen in real time, and you have to have the bandwidth from that venue to get that signal up to the CDN in the first place. And that's one of the key challenges we're going to talk about going forward. So a good example of live 4K video production, there are a number of times when you want to do it. The most obvious one is you've got 4K cameras, you've got 4K computers or displays that you're trying to switch between and replicate out. That's the most straightforward. But there are cases where you might have 1080p sources and you still want to stream at 4K. We'll talk about reasons for wanting to do that. And in a lot of cases, you're going to have mixed sources. So you may have one 4K camera or a couple cameras and a 1080p source. So a lot of the production when you're doing a 4K event is mixing in some of those HD sources with natural 4K cameras or natural 4K sources, and we'll look at a couple of those examples. So the first one I wanted to talk about was end-to-end 4K production and streaming. This is a case where, for example, you'll have a couple 4K cameras and maybe a 4K or a 1080p laptop, and you're trying to switch between different camera angles as well as bring in sources, slides, or whatever from a 4K laptop or a 1080. So again, streaming this kind of event where everything is 4K right from the cameras all the way through to your viewers, one of the key things is having the uplink bandwidth to make that all happen. That's one of the things you need to plan for in advance, because we will talk about bit rates and things going forward, but it takes quite a bit of bit rate to get those signals up into the cloud. In this particular example, you could have a couple different camera angles of different 4K cameras, and then you could be mixing in some HD sources. So if you had something like a HD chart that was coming from that laptop, you can crop something from your 4K, add in some 1080 content, and you're still streaming at 4K for the overall size of the frame, but you're mixing in a bunch of sources together. And this is typically the way it's done today, is cropping out of the 4K and then switching back between a full 4K view and back between a smaller view where you're mixing in some HD sources. So that's kind of the simplest case, but to do this you need a fair amount of equipment and personnel. And the first one is you're going to need those 4K cameras. So you need multiple cameras and probably an operator on each of those cameras. You need those 4K or HD video sources, and then one or more producers. And by producers, I mean someone who's actually deciding, when do I switch from this camera view to that camera view? When do I cut to the slides? When do I do a picture-in-picture? So someone who's just really orchestrating that event and doing all of that switching. In order to do the actual compression live in real time at 4K, you're going to need a fairly powerful computer. So Intel i7 is recommended. You're going to need 4K capture cards, obviously, to bring those 4K signals in from either your cameras or your laptops, and a 4K capable mixing software that allows you to do that streaming. So whether that's done on an all-in-one appliance, and for those of you who know Epiphan Video, where I work, we do have these all-in-one appliances. We also have these 4K capture cards. So we play in both of these spaces. But if you're using the 4K capture card, you're going to need a fairly hefty PC to do the encoding for you. At 4K, it takes quite a bit to do that encoding. A second scenario I want to walk through is what we call the 4K composite streaming and recording. And the idea here is that you're starting with 1080p sources, but you have reason to put them together into a 4K frame and stream and record that frame out. And there's a number of examples where you might want to do that. And it's convenient that exactly 4 times a full HD signal is a 4K signal, so that you don't have to do any scaling of these sources. You can literally tile 4 of them together and build a 4K frame. So many of the equipment that you'll see that can do this kind of encoding, if you can bring in 4 HD signals, you can composite them all together and be able to do that. And we see that for security cameras, where people have multiple cameras, multiple views, but they don't want to lose any detail or resolution when they're streaming that out because it's being monitored at a remote site. Or another case is user experience labs, where you might have multiple cameras on the subject. You're also trying to capture the app or whatever it is they're manipulating. And again, you don't want to lose resolution by scaling everything down, but you're starting with 1080p signals, and then you're just going to composite them into a larger frame. Video wall recording is another one. If you're in a control room with multiple screens, again, you want to stream that out to somebody remote so they can see what the situation is, but you don't want to condense or kind of scale down that information. You want to give it out at full resolution. So there's lots of these reasons. Here's an example of just a bunch of cameras inside a casino. So again, we're building one 4K frame, but it's all being tiled out of HD sources. So these are 4 HD cameras, and you're just compositing them together, sending them out at one stream so that the user doesn't have to manage 4 streams. They get one stream, but it's 4 views already packaged at the production site to be 4 different full HD streams. This is another example for UX labs, where you have a camera on the face, you have a camera on the person manipulating the app or whatever it is they're testing, and then you're capturing the app right from that device as well. So again, just being able to lay out multiple 1080p signals into one larger frame gives you a single reference, a single video of either recording or streaming out, so that people can experience all of those views at the same time in good resolution. So I think I've covered most of this. It's pretty much the same hardware requirements as doing the 4K live production, except you won't need the 4K capture cards. You just need HD capture cards coming in, or HD sources coming in, and then you still need something that is capable of encoding in real time a 4K output, which is usually H.264. I wanted to just stop and talk about the bandwidth problem that we have with 4K, because it's fairly easy. The 4K cameras already exist, 4K laptops already exist, switchers already exist. That's the easy part. The difficult part is getting that content out of the room and up to the CDN or the distribution point. And so today, a lot of people are asking us when we're talking about our 4K products, is 4K streaming really feasible? I say yes, it is feasible in terms of all the equipment you need, but it's not very common. And the main reason it's not common is that most people are still struggling to get out of buildings at 1080p or 720p, and it's mainly a bandwidth issue. It's not got to do with the switchers or the mixers or the cameras. All of that equipment is 4K capable, but getting out of the building, today we see people streaming, if they're at 720, it's usually at least 2 megabits, sometimes as much as 4, and at 1080p they tend to be in the sort of 4 to 8 or 6 to 8 range. And even at these bit rates, getting a solid uplink can be a challenge depending on the venue that you're in. And you have to remember that you don't just need that bandwidth for a short period of time. It has to be for the whole duration of the event. So if you're doing something like this and recording a session where this runs all day, you need that solid 8 megabits per second all day, right? It can't be going up and down and sometimes 4 and sometimes 3. You need it pretty steady, and that's the big challenge. So when we try to move from 720 streaming up to 4K streaming, remember 720 is 1/9 of the bandwidth of a 4K signal. So you're talking about 9 times the bit rate of 720 and 4 times the bit rate generally of 1080p. So it is a pretty big extension. So for 4K, you might need something like 20 to 30 megabits of really good bandwidth, uplink bandwidth throughout your entire event, and that can be very hard to find. It can be very challenging. Luckily, there are a couple technologies coming down the pipe that's going to make this much easier. It's very practical within a LAN right now. So if you're in an organization, you're streaming within a venue, that's not bad. That kind of bandwidth is easy to come by. But when you're trying to get that out and up to a distribution point such as a CDN, that's where the real challenge becomes. So there are a few technologies that are coming down the pipe that are going to make 4K streaming much easier than it is today. So today it's pretty tough to get out of a building at 4K. The first one is HEVC. So HEVC, otherwise known as H.265, is the successor to H.264, and it promises to have the same video quality at about half the bit rate. So instead of needing that 20 to 30 megabits to get out of the building at 4K, now you're down to the 12 to 15, which is still a lot of bandwidth, but much more manageable than 30. Cellular bonding is another technology that you can readily find today that allows you to take multiple LTE modems basically and bond them together. So you get 4 megabits out of one, 3 megabits out of another, 5 megabits. You can glue it all together and build yourself a pipe that is reliable and gets you that bandwidth. In our tests where we've done that, we found reliability of that is difficult. So if you have a short event, you may be able to do it. Longer events, to get a steady 8 megabits or 10 megabits out of a bonded cellular solution all day is, in our experience, a little bit difficult. So if you're in a fixed location and you know what that LTE service is and it's very sort of dependable and predictable, that's great. But if you're taking your gear and going to a venue to stream an event, often just arriving and expecting that you're going to be able to get LTE bandwidth very easily because you're bonding it can be a bit of a challenge, and that's what we've found as we've gone out and done some events with our gear. We're finding that bonding cellular is great in some locations and not so great in others, and it can fluctuate pretty greatly over the day, so you have to be very careful. But luckily there are more and more locations that are coming out with dedicated data bandwidth, so large hotels, large venues where you can ask for and pay for a dedicated circuit coming out that will be guaranteed to give you that steady bit rate. So those are becoming more popular. Cellular bonding is only going to get better. When we saw the jump from 3G to LTE, that bandwidth is much bigger, and that's going to continue. And HEVC is going to help cut the required bandwidth in half. So things are definitely getting better. So for live production today, a lot of it is actually being done produced at 4K but streamed out at 720 and 1080 because of the bandwidth issue, and I'm going to talk about a couple of those scenario. So one is where you've got 4K sources, but you're scaling them all down to 1080p because you don't need to record them at 4K, you don't need to stream them, you haven't got that bandwidth. So you're going to go out of the building at 720 or 1080, but when you show up and you've got your gear, you're presented with 4K cameras and 4K laptops. You need to be able to bring that data in, scale it down, and then bring it into your equipment to encode it at either 720 or 1080. So that's perfect for locations where you've got fixed 4K cameras, so you're not bringing your own camera, you're showing up and the guy says, here's your 4K feed. You better have a 4K capture card or at least an encoder that can deal with that. Another really popular one is what we call the virtual multi-camera, or the virtual PTZ. And the idea here is instead of literally having multiple cameras, you have one 4K camera that's covering the whole wide stage, if it's a stage or whatever you're trying to capture. And then what you're doing is cropping out areas of interest from within that larger 4K frame. So you're going to be streaming out at 1080 or 720, but you're going to be capturing everything at 4K and then basically taking little crops or excerpts out of that 4K image that you can switch between to simulate a multi-camera experience. So you could have a a close-up on the podium. You could have a wide stage that captures the whole thing, and you can be switching between those. So the idea, as you saw in the presidential debate, 2 8x9 frames make a 16x9 frame. And these podiums were, I don't know, 20, 25 feet apart, but for a lot of the production, what they did was they cut them out and they put them side by side, and that's a really popular thing. So they've got one large 4K image, they're cutting out Trump on one side and Clinton on the other, and then they're gluing them together into a 1080p frame and streaming that out. So when you're starting with 4K with one wide frame, you can cut out 1080 chunks of it very, very easily and get to areas of interest. So you can cut out people in a group, or in a courtroom scenario, you could have the jury and the judge separately, and then the idea is over time you're doing live switching in your production, so you can switch from the judge to the jury, back to the judge. It makes the presentation much more dynamic for the viewers, because you're giving them multi-camera angles, but you're not requiring to actually have multiple cameras. You're just using one 4K source and cutting out the areas of interest and switching between them live. So the advantage of this is you only need one 4K camera. So in comparison to the first scenario where I showed where you had multiple 4K cameras and a laptop and you're bringing all that in this case you just need one 4K camera. One person can produce the whole show. You don't need multiple camera operators. You'll still need a very powerful computer to do that encoding and all of the scaling and cropping, or you can use an all-in-one mixer streamer encoder that does that. We recently did a write-up in Streaming Media Producer that you can look up that details exactly how to do this kind of virtual PTZ and how to switch between different 1080 sources that are actually all just virtual cutouts from a 4K. Of course, Epiphan Video does have products that suit this space, and Pearl 2 is one that we announced very recently. It's an all-in-one switching, mixing, streaming, recording, takes in 4K signals. So all of the scenarios that I showed here where you're compositing multiple HDs into one 4K frame, or you're bringing in 4K sources and switching in between them, or you're cutting them out and doing that multi-PTZ, this one little box can do all of that. So definitely on the side for the equipment where it comes to cameras and switchers and those kind of things, there's very affordable equipment to do your production at 4K. The most costly piece and difficult piece is the bandwidth to get out of your venue and up to your distribution point. And once you can solve that problem, then the equipment side in the room is fairly easy. It's a fairly easy way to go. So that was all I had to talk about today. I don't know if there are any questions that people want to ask.
Does anyone have any questions for David? Anyone have a question about the work?
No?
All right, go ahead.
Are there challenges in using HEVC into CDNs? Are they set up to be able to ingest HEVC content?
They're getting there. So I would say it's not very prevalent now, but it will be very shortly. I think the biggest challenge with HEVC is that, especially if you're encoding at 4K, it takes a lot of power just to encode 4K at H.264. When you go to HEVC, it's roughly about 8 to 10 times the compute power to get that benefit of half the bit rate. So I think on the distribution side, those guys are pretty much ready for it. But on the contribution side and the encoder side, there's very few small sort of lightweight encoders that can do a 4K frame at HEVC. So I think the distribution side's ahead of the contribution side right now, but I think we'll see encoders start to catch up, and then we'll see people ingesting at 4K. But YouTube doesn't do it just yet. I think you have to stream to them at 1080, but then you can give them a recorded source. Or sorry, no, I'm sorry. You can stream to them at 4K. Their distribution will be 1080 if it's live, but the VOD can then be 4K. So YouTube already supports a 4K ingest. I'm not sure if it's HEVC. I've only tried it at H.264, but I believe they support VP9 and HEVC as well. Yeah.
Okay, round of applause, David.
Sorry, there was one other question, but I can get that.
Can we take a question after?
Did you?
All right.
That one's a little tougher. I think in the browsers and things, it's Netflix and other guys who are starting to drive that adoption. So it's more the over-the-top that is pushing that in. So I think most of the browsers and most of the players now can support HEVC playback, and that's because the over-the-top stuff is using it pretty prevalently now. So by the time the live guys get there and do HEVC, it should be no problem from a player perspective. That's pretty well established by the OTT guys.
Okay, so the prize that one of these guys is going to win?
Yes,
is what?
it's called an AVIO 4K. It's a USB. I have it at the booth, so you'll have to come by our booth and collect it. But it's basically an external capture dongle. It's just about this big. You plug in your 4K source. It's USB on the other side, so you can bring in a 4K laptop or a 4K display into a laptop or a computer and use Wirecast or OBS or anything to produce a show from that. So it's just a little dongle to bring that in.
And
the winner is Derek Cullison.
Derek here?
Yep.
All right.
There we go.
Congratulations.
So you'll have to come by the Epiphan booth and we'll give you your brand new AVIO 4K.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Sounds good.